Welcome, dear listener. Find a comfortable place to rest and let your body sink a little deeper into wherever you are right now. Take a slow breath, let your shoulders drop, and allow the quiet to settle around you. Tonight, we're going to travel together, gently, unhurriedly, back through the long corridors of history, to places and people that the centuries have only made more mysterious. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do. Just listen and let the stories carry you. Let us begin with a face, not with the sweeping political upheavals, not with the religious earthquake that shook an entire civilization to its foundations, not with the disappearance that has puzzled scholars for 3,000 years. We begin simply, quietly, with a face. In the year 1912, a German archaeological expedition was carefully sifting through the ruins of a place called Amarna, an ancient city half swallowed by the Egyptian desert. Among the broken fragments, the scattered debris, and the half-finished carvings left behind in what appeared to have been a sculptor's working studio, they discovered something extraordinary. Sitting in the dust, composed and patient, as though she had simply been waiting for the right moment to be found again. There she was, Nefertiti, her high cheekbones carved with breathtaking precision, her skin rendered smooth and ageless, that long, graceful neck rising with quiet authority. And above it all, the iconic blue crown, tall and commanding, as though she had always known she would outlast the centuries. One eye was absent from the sculpture, a strange, hollow gap that somehow deepened her mystique rather than diminishing it. Imperfection, it seemed, only made her more captivating. The world looked upon her and was stunned. She did not resemble an artifact from antiquity. She looked contemporary. She looked vital. She could have stepped from the pages of a fashion magazine or turned heads at the most refined gathering in any modern city. And just like that, with a single discovery in the Egyptian sand, she became the iconic face of ancient Egypt, recognized across the globe, printed on souvenirs, gazed upon in museum galleries, studied and admired by millions. But there is something the souvenir shops tend to leave out. Most historians believe this celebrated bust was never intended as a finished royal portrait. It was almost certainly a sculptor's reference model, the ancient equivalent of a sample, a study piece pinned to a workshop wall for artists to consult as they crafted official imagery. Which means that the most recognized face in the ancient world, the face that launched 1,000 scholarly debates and graced the covers of countless books, may have achieved its immortality because someone in Amarna simply never bothered to tidy up their studio. That is not mythic destiny. That is extraordinary timing. And yet, and this is worth pausing over, look more closely at the craftsmanship. The pigment blending is masterful. The proportions are exquisite. The subtle upward curve of the lips suggests a consciousness, a knowing quality. This was not careless work. Even as a reference model, it was executed with the kind of precision that takes years to develop and a lifetime to perfect. Ancient Egyptian art was never casual decoration. It was deliberate, purposeful, politically charged. Every representation carried weight. Every image of a figure in stone or paint was a statement of power and legitimacy. So if this was merely the working draft, one can only imagine how commanding the finished royal imagery must have been. And then there is her expression. Look at it long enough, and something quietly unsettling settles in. Calm, controlled, faintly distant, not smiling, not frowning, simply aware. It is the face of someone who already knows the ending of a conversation you have not yet begun, which, as it turns out, may be entirely fitting. Because before we even approach the question of whether she eventually ruled as pharaoh, or whether her disappearance was a political maneuver rather than a personal tragedy, we must acknowledge one thing clearly. Nefertiti understood the power of image. Or, at the very least, someone who moved in her orbit understood it profoundly. And in a civilization that inscribed its history in stone, making sure your face survived long enough to keep people arguing was perhaps the most elegant strategy of all. Not bad for a practice piece. Now that we have admired the cheekbones at sufficient length, let us talk about something more substantial. Let us talk about power. Nefertiti held the position of great royal wife to the Pharaoh Akhenaten. And if that sounds like a conventional royal arrangement, it was anything but. Akhenaten was not a typical ruler. Most Egyptian pharaohs operated within a structure that had functioned smoothly for centuries. Honoring the established gods, maintaining the influential priestly class, constructing temples, winning battles on the frontier, and passing the arrangement intact to the next generation. Akhenaten looked upon that entire structure and said, with quiet but unmistakable finality, no. He elevated Aten, the physical disk of the sun, above all other deities, not as one god among many, not as the most honored among equals, as the singular divine force, the sprawling pantheon that Egyptians had assembled across centuries. Amun, Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Hathor was pushed aside. Temples were shuttered or repurposed. The names of other gods were struck from monuments. The powerful priesthood of Amun, which had for generations wielded extraordinary economic and political influence, found itself quietly but decisively sidelined. This was not religious reform in any gentle sense. This was a theological earthquake, and Nefertiti was not standing at the edge of it, holding flowers and offering quiet support. In the relief carvings that survive from the Amarna period, she appears nearly equal in scale to the king himself. In ancient Egyptian art, size was not an accident. The larger the figure, the greater the significance. She is not rendered small, not positioned modestly behind the throne. She performs ritual offerings to Aten. She participates in sacred ceremonies, and in certain striking images, she is shown in the act of smiting enemies. A pose, a posture, a declaration that had for generations been reserved exclusively for pharaohs. Queens in ancient Egypt could wield influence, certainly, but they were not typically depicted in official state imagery, performing the acts of a co-ruler. This was not decorative symbolism. This was a carefully composed message. Akhenaten and Nefertiti presented themselves as a unified divine partnership, two figures through whom the sun's grace flowed equally. The rays of Aten extending toward both of them, each ray ending in a tiny hand, offering the Ankh, the sign of life. Not to him alone, to them both. That is not accident. That is branding of the highest order. Some scholars have proposed that she may have formally served as co-regent in the later years of Akhenaten's reign, meaning she shared not just ceremonial visibility, but actual ruling authority. If this is true, then the title Great Royal Wife feels almost quaint. Because what the carvings show is not a supportive spouse. What they show is shared governance. And that is precisely where the mystery begins to deepen. Because if she was already functioning as a ruler while he lived, what becomes of her story when he no longer did? To understand the full weight of Nefertiti's position, we need to sit with just how radical this religious transformation truly was. Ancient Egypt did not treat its gods lightly, nor did it rearrange them casually. Across thousands of years, the Egyptians had assembled a rich and layered pantheon, divine presences for every aspect of existence, from the flooding of the Nile to the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Temples were not merely places of worship. They were economic institutions. The priests who served within them controlled vast landholdings, managed enormous stores of wealth, and held political influence that rivaled, and sometimes exceeded, that of the pharaoh himself. Religion was not separate from the infrastructure of power. Religion was the infrastructure of power. Then Akhenaten stepped in, and in essence declared the whole arrangement simplified. Aten, represented not as a human figure or an animal form, but as the pure physical disk of the sun, became the sole focus of worship. Other deities were not openly declared non-existent, but they were stripped of their resources, their ceremonies, their public recognition. Their names were carved out of temple walls. In ancient Egypt, erasing a god's name was not a symbolic gesture. It was an act of aggression. It was a declaration of intent. And Nefertiti stood beside him throughout all of it. The art produced during the Amarna period is unlike anything Egypt created before or after it. Gone are the rigid, formal poses of earlier dynasties, the stiff figures standing in eternal, unchanging attitudes of power. In their place, something almost tender emerges. The royal family shown sitting together beneath the sun's rays, playing with their daughters, kissing their children, existing in a space that feels almost intimate. The proportions of the figures shift dramatically. Bodies are elongated, faces narrow. The visual language itself changes. And those tiny hands at the end of Aten's rays reach toward Nefertiti as surely as they reach toward the king. This is subtle, but it carries extraordinary weight. It says that divine favor flows through both of them equally. She is not the queen standing beside the conduit of divine power. She is part of that conduit. By centralizing worship around Aten and presenting themselves as the sole intermediaries between the sun god and the people, Akhenaten and Nefertiti simultaneously tightened their grip on power. The priesthood lost influence. The royal household gained it. It was political genius wrapped in theological language. And if Akhenaten was the architect of this restructuring, Nefertiti appears to have been not merely its supporter, but its co-designer. When religion and governance are fused so completely, removing one figure from the arrangement becomes enormously complicated, especially when that figure understands exactly how the machinery works. If you are going to overturn centuries of religious tradition, sideline the most powerful priestly institution in the country, and establish what amounts to a near monotheistic devotion centered on the sun, it probably makes sense not to remain in a capital city full of reminders of everything you have just dismantled. Too many old temples, too many displaced priests, too many cold stares from those whose livelihoods depended on the old order. Akhenaten responded in the way that confident revolutionaries sometimes do. He built a new city. Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten, was constructed on previously uninhabited land along the Nile, in the place we now call Amarna. It rose from bare earth with remarkable speed. Fresh temples, fresh administrative buildings, fresh start. No old gods watching from the walls. No accumulated weight of tradition pressing down from every carved column. And Nefertiti went with him. More than that, she flourished there. The art of Amarna captures something that feels genuinely new. The royal couple and their daughters appear in scenes of domestic warmth, sitting together, playing, illuminated by the outstretched rays of their sun god. It feels almost human in a way that earlier dynastic art rarely permitted, and throughout all of it, Nefertiti is present with a visibility that feels almost insistent. Nearly equal in scale to the king, participating in ceremonies independently. In some reliefs, she drives a chariot. In others, she stands alone, making offerings to Aten without the king beside her. Amarna was not simply a city, it was a stage. The royal couple were its central performers, and the narrative they were performing was one of divine unity, sacred partnership, chosen authority. Everything about the city, its layout, its temples, its art, was designed to communicate a specific message about the nature of power and its source, which suggests something worth considering quietly. If you are redesigning not only religion, but architecture and visual culture all at once, you are also redesigning how authority itself is perceived. And Nefertiti's presence in that redesign was not passive. It was deliberate. It was structural. She did not simply support the king's image. She mirrored it. And in a society where the visual language of art was inseparable from the language of power, to mirror the king was not a small thing. But revolutions are fragile. And when a new order depends so heavily on image and unity, the disappearance of one half of that image can begin to unravel everything. By the time Amarna had reached its full expression, something in the art began to shift. Nefertiti was no longer merely standing beside power. In certain reliefs, she was beginning to look like it. She appears wearing the blue crown, typically reserved for royalty. She is depicted in postures once restricted to pharaohs, and in one particularly striking image, she is shown in the act of smiting enemies, arm raised, posture commanding, the arrangement of her body precisely mirroring the stance that Egyptian kings had used for generations to proclaim their authority. That imagery was not distributed casually. In ancient Egyptian visual language, the smiting pose was a direct declaration: I maintain divine order. I am the boundary between civilization and chaos. I am the one who protects. Here was Nefertiti making that declaration without hesitation. Some scholars argue that, in the later portion of Akhenaten's reign, she may have assumed the formal role of co-regent. Not ceremonial, not symbolic. Actual shared ruling authority. If this is accurate, the title Great Royal Wife becomes inadequate in the way that a small door is inadequate for a large cathedral, and then the names begin to shift. Around this same period, inscriptions begin to mention a figure whose name carries a particular resonance: Neferneferuaten. Look at the syllables. Nefertiti's full name was Neferneferuaten Nefertiti. The overlap is not subtle. Some scholars see coincidence. Others see transition. Egyptian pharaohs adopted formal throne names upon ascending to full kingship. If Nefertiti stepped into sole or co-regency rule, she would have needed a name appropriate to that station. Not her queen's name, but something more formally royal. And if she did assume such a role, the visual representation of her would have shifted accordingly. Less queen, more king. Ancient Egypt had precedent for this. Hatshepsut, centuries earlier, had ruled as pharaoh and adopted male regalia, the ceremonial false beard, the traditional posture, the iconographic language of kingship. This was not deception. It was institutional compliance. Kingship was a role with specific visual requirements, and if you held the role, you wore the costume that went with it. Which brings us to the question quietly at the heart of all of this. Did Nefertiti change the mask she wore in order to hold the power she already had? Because in ancient Egypt, Power was not simply inherited, it was performed, and she may have been extraordinarily skilled at performing it. After years of extraordinary visibility, her image everywhere, her role embedded in the theology of a new religious order, her presence equal to the king's in every significant piece of official art, Nefertiti simply vanishes from the historical record. Not gradually, not with ceremony, just gone. Around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, her presence in inscriptions and reliefs drops away. The royal pairing that had been so insistently depicted, the unified divine couple standing together beneath Aten's rays, begins to fragment. For someone so deliberately, so architecturally present in the visual culture of her era, the silence is extraordinary. In ancient Egypt, the death of a significant royal figure was a state event. It was documented, commemorated, inscribed. A tomb was prepared. Mourning rituals were recorded. The transition of a soul through the afterlife required careful ritual acknowledgement. If Nefertiti had died, whether from the plague that claimed several of her daughters around this period, or from some other cause, we would expect traces of that death to exist somewhere. Instead, we find ambiguity. Some historians suggest illness, some propose political disgrace. But erasure in ancient Egypt typically left visible marks, names scratched out, faces chiseled from walls, images destroyed. What we find with Nefertiti is not violent removal, it is absence. And absence, in a system where identity depended on being inscribed in stone, is its own kind of statement. Unless the absence is not an absence at all, unless the name simply changed. Because around the same time Nefertiti fades from view, Neferneferuaten appears in inscriptions, sometimes accompanied by epithets that translate, in their feminine grammatical forms, to something like beloved of Akhenaten, or effective for her husband. The grammatical femininity of certain inscriptions narrows the field of candidates considerably. And in a period of such concentrated royal upheaval, there are very few female figures of sufficient standing to have held such a title. Could Nefertiti have stepped into a new identity, not disappeared, but transformed? In a civilization where pharaohs carried multiple names and layered divine titles, where identity at the highest levels of power was fluid and ceremonially reinvented at each transition of rule, this is not a strange idea. It is perhaps the most logical one available, which means we may have been looking for her in the wrong place. Not because she vanished, but because we have been searching under the name she wore as queen rather than the name she may have worn as king. The figure of Smenkhare adds another layer of rich uncertainty. This name appears in inscriptions toward the end of Akhenaten's reign, sometimes as co-regent. The identity behind it remains stubbornly unclear. Some evidence points toward a male relative. Other evidence, particularly the feminine grammatical markers found in certain versions of the associated inscriptions, has led scholars to suggest that Smenkhare and Neferneferuaten may have been the same person, and that person may have been Nefertiti. If so, then her arc through history describes not a disappearance, but a metamorphosis. Queen, co-regent, possibly king. Each transition requiring a new identity, new iconography, new institutional presentation. Hatshepsut had navigated exactly that kind of reinvention. The false beard, the masculine regalia. Not disguise in any theatrical sense, but compliance with a system whose requirements were non-negotiable. To rule Egypt, you had to fit the shape of a pharaoh. And the shape of a pharaoh, linguistically and ritually, was male. Any shift in how Nefertiti was depicted, a more formal bearing, a more masculine presentation, might not mark her replacement. It might mark her adaptation. And here is where the idea of having fooled the world becomes interesting in a more nuanced sense than simple deception. We look for clean lines in history, clear successions, definitive deaths, unambiguous rulers. But ancient politics was layered, overlapping, deliberately obscured. If Nefertiti navigated a system designed to constrain female authority, not by confronting it directly, but by moving carefully within it, that is not trickery. That is a different, subtler, more demanding kind of power. The kind that rarely appears on souvenir mugs. Whatever Nefertiti may or may not have ruled, the revolution she helped construct did not last. After Akhenaten's death, the world of Amarna began to come apart with a startling speed. The temples to Aten fell quiet. The priests of the old gods began quietly, methodically reclaiming their influence. The capital was abandoned. Statues were defaced. Names were removed from monuments. Egypt had tried something unprecedented, and Egypt decided it preferred the familiar. Enter Tutankhamun, first known as Tutankhaten, the name connecting him to Aten's worship, then renamed to honor Amun, the very god whose priesthood had been so aggressively sidelined. That name change is not subtle. It is a theological course correction announced in a single proper noun. Under Tutankhamun, traditional worship was formally restored. The old gods returned, welcomed back not as defeated absentees, but as eternal presences whose temporary displacement was quietly reframed as something that had barely happened at all. Temples were reopened. The priestly class reassumed authority. The delicate, revolutionary world of Amarna began to be dismantled, stone by stone. This restoration created a complicated situation for anyone whose identity had been deeply entangled with Aten's revolution. History in ancient Egypt was not neutral, it was managed. Akhenaten's name was eventually chiseled from king lists. His reign was treated not as a chapter, but as an aberration, a period that later rulers chose to excise from the official story. Amarna was dismantled, its carefully constructed temples repurposed, its innovative art packed away beneath the sand. The entire ideological experiment was quietly reclassified as heresy. If Nefertiti had been deeply embedded in that experiment, as queen, as co-regent, as possible pharaoh during the unstable transition that followed Akhenaten's death, her association with it would have made her memory inconvenient, not hated, not cursed in the way Akhenaten came to be, just inconvenient. And inconvenience in a system built on stone inscriptions was managed not through dramatic confrontation, but through strategic silence. You do not destroy the memory. You allow it to blur. You let the cartouches remain partially incomplete. You leave the titles fragmented. You permit just enough ambiguity that certainty becomes impossible. Destruction leaves scars that can be studied. Ambiguity leaves mystery. And mystery is harder to resolve, which presents a haunting possibility. Perhaps Nefertiti did not vanish through tragedy or scandal. Perhaps she was simply edited, carefully, deliberately, by people who had found a new story to tell and needed the old one to recede gracefully into the background. And if that is true, the greatest illusion in her story is not one she created. It is one that was created around her. History, as it turns out, belongs to whoever holds the chisel last. Now let us talk honestly about something. If Nefertiti had not left behind that bust, this conversation might never have happened. Her face became the gateway through which the world entered her story. When the bust was first unveiled in Berlin, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Newspapers declared her the most beautiful woman of antiquity. The public was captivated. Museums competed for access. She became an icon with extraordinary speed, not primarily because of her political significance, but because of her aesthetics. And therein lies a quiet irony. Beauty, it turns out, can be a distraction. The more we focus on the symmetry of her cheekbones, the elegance of that neck, the serene perfection of her expression, the more easily we slide past the substance beneath the surface. Her involvement in a radical religious overhaul, her possible co-regency, her apparent participation in what may have been one of the most audacious restructurings of power in ancient history. Those things become footnotes beneath the aesthetics. If a male ruler had engineered what Akhenaten and Nefertiti together engineered, a theological revolution, a new capital, the sidelining of an entrenched priestly class, a possible consolidation of royal authority, we would speak of him in the language of strategy and ambition. With Nefertiti, the conversation often begins with her appearance. She becomes the beautiful queen first, the revolutionary second. That framing softens her. It makes her safe. It makes her manageable. But the evidence from Amarna does not describe a passive figure. It describes someone who participated in state ritual with authority, who was depicted in poses traditionally reserved for rulers, who mirrored the king in both scale and posture across countless official images. That is not ornamental influence. That is functional power. It is entirely possible that the blurring of Nefertiti's political legacy, both in antiquity and in modern memory, was achieved partly through aesthetics. Allow her to drift into the realm of beauty and elegance. Allow her to become a symbol of timeless femininity. And once someone is reduced to image, their agency becomes negotiable. Their history becomes decorative. Perhaps the world did not need Nefertiti to fool it. Perhaps the world was perfectly willing to fool itself. We looked at the face and assumed we understood the person. We admired the artistry and overlooked the strategy. We saw elegance and forgot to ask what it concealed. And that may be the most enduring illusion of all. When Tutankhamun's tomb was opened in 1922, the world acquired a new obsession: gold, glittering quantities of it. A teenage king interred in layers of extraordinary luxury, his face hidden behind a mask so beautiful it stopped conversations entirely. The narrative of the late 18th dynasty, a period of extraordinary upheaval and uncertainty, suddenly resolved itself into a single gleaming image. The boy king, the golden mask, the impeccably preserved treasure. And Nefertiti, the woman who may have helped design the revolution that Tutankhamun was tasked with dismantling, receded into background mystery. DNA analysis has suggested that Tutankhamun was Akhenaten's son, but his mother appears to have been one of Akhenaten's sisters rather than Nefertiti herself, which means Nefertiti's precise relationship to the boy king, stepmother, political guardian, potential rival, is yet another thread in the tangle that surrounds her. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: after Akhenaten's death, Egypt entered a brief, unstable, transitional period. Names appeared and vanished in inscriptions with unsettling speed. Rulers overlapped. Authority was contested or unclear. The consolidated power that Akhenaten and Nefertiti had built around Aten began to erode almost immediately. Then Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun, and the restoration began. Whoever held authority in the gap between Akhenaten's death and Tutankhamun's consolidation of power was navigating one of the most delicate moments in Egyptian political history. If Nefertiti was that figure, under whatever name she may have carried, she was standing at the edge of a collapsing ideological structure, trying to manage a transition that was moving faster than any single ruler could easily control. Tutankhamun's reign made practical, brilliant choices. Restore the old gods. Repair the temples. Reassure the priesthood. Stabilize the religious system. Reinstate the relationship between the palace and the institutions of traditional worship. These were the decisions of careful, pragmatic governance. And a careful, pragmatic government does not emphasize the complicated figures from the period it is working to move beyond. The boy king became the headline. The golden mask became the symbol. And the woman who may have co-authored the revolution, and possibly navigated its collapse, became a question mark. History has always preferred spectacle over subtlety. Tutankhamun had spectacle. Nefertiti, if she ruled at all, appears to have ruled through precisely the kind of quiet, layered authority that leaves fewer shining artifacts behind. But perhaps that too is fitting. If she truly mastered the art of image and narrative, if she understood that sometimes the most effective move is to become unreadable rather than legible, then fading into ambiguity might not be a failure. It might be the final, most elegant chapter of a life spent understanding exactly how power works. We still have not found her tomb. Let that rest quietly for a moment. One of the most visually represented women in the entire ancient world. The central figure of a religious revolution, a possible co-regent, a possible pharaoh, and we do not know where she is buried. For ancient Egypt, this is unusual. Royal burials were not informal. They were monumental undertakings, planned years in advance, elaborately decorated, documented in ways designed to ensure the safe passage of the soul through the afterlife and the preservation of the ruler's identity for eternity. Even in cases where later rulers attempted to erase predecessors, tombs left traces that could be followed. With Nefertiti, nothing has been confirmed. Some researchers suggest she may have been buried in Amarna, the revolutionary city she inhabited in life. Others believe her remains may lie somewhere in the Valley of the Kings. A few years ago, a compelling theory emerged, based on ground-penetrating radar readings, that a hidden chamber might exist behind the walls of Tutankhamun's famous tomb. For a brief, electric moment, it seemed as though history might be about to offer an answer. Headlines erupted. The world held its breath. The evidence proved inconclusive, which leaves us with an unsettling possibility. If Nefertiti ruled under a different name, Neferneferuaten, or another throne name entirely, then her burial might not bear the name Nefertiti at all. A tomb inscribed for a short-lived pharaoh known by a formal throne name, in a period when records were subsequently damaged or deliberately obscured, could easily remain unidentified even if physically intact. And if her association with Akhenaten's revolution made her memory politically inconvenient during the restoration that followed, her tomb might have been quietly repurposed, its inscriptions overwritten, its contents redistributed. Ancient Egyptian history is full of reused monuments. Stone was permanent. Names were not. For a woman whose face became one of the most recognized in the history of human civilization, the absence of a known resting place carries its own strange power. We know her features with extraordinary intimacy. We debate the contours of her authority. We argue over her identity, but we do not know where she rests. And as long as her tomb remains hidden, the final chapter of her story remains open, unwritten, waiting. After everything, The revolution, the debates over co-regency, the shifting names, the vanishing from the record, the missing tomb. We return to the question that started all of this. Did Nefertiti fool the world? Perhaps. But not through elaborate deception. Not through theatrical disguise or manufactured spectacle. Ancient Egypt was a complicated political environment, but it was not a palace soap opera. At least, not entirely. What she may have accomplished is something considerably more impressive. She navigated one of the most politically volatile periods in the entire 3,000-year span of Egyptian civilization, with remarkable visibility and adaptability. She stood beside a king who dismantled centuries of religious tradition, and she did not stand behind him. She stood with him at equal scale in stone. She appeared in roles conventionally reserved for male rulers. She may have stepped into kingship during a fragile transition, and when the system shifted again, and the old order reclaimed its authority, her identity dissolved into ambiguity rather than into outright condemnation. That is not accidental. That is political survival. And political survival in ancient Egypt, where the wrong association could get your name erased from monuments and your memory deleted from king lists, was among the most difficult achievements available to anyone in power. If she ruled briefly under another name, she understood that authority required transformation. If she withdrew during the restoration of traditional religion, she understood that sometimes the most intelligent move is a strategic retreat. And if later rulers chose to blur rather than destroy her memory, that tells us something important in itself, that she mattered enough to require careful management. The irony that runs beneath all of it is quiet, but persistent. We remember her because of her face, but that face may be the least significant thing about her. The bust gave her immortality. Her political maneuvering, whatever its precise shape, gave her mystery. And mystery is powerful, precisely because certainty would close the conversation. Ambiguity keeps it alive, reverberating across 3,000 years, drawing scholars and storytellers and curious listeners back again and again to the same unresolved questions. Maybe she did not fool the world. Maybe she simply allowed the world to see what it wished to see. Beauty, serenity, elegance, the composed surface of a face carved in limestone, while the real work happened in the space behind that surface. In the negotiations, and the rituals, and the carefully managed images, and the throne names, and the quiet adaptations of a person who understood that power is not a fixed thing. It is a performance, and she performed it with extraordinary skill. Or perhaps history simply fractured around her, leaving us with pieces that resist assembly, fragments that suggest the shape of a whole we will never quite hold. Either way, here we are, still searching for her tomb, still debating whether she ruled, vanished, or transformed herself into something the historical record cannot quite name. Still circling the same questions, drawn in by the same composed, quiet, slightly knowing face. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Nefertiti. Not a final answer, not a closed case, but a question that has refused to disappear for 3,000 years, and shows no sign of doing so now. Let that thought settle softly over you as you rest. The sands of ancient Egypt are very quiet tonight. The moon, if there is one, hangs over ruins that have been asking the same question for millennia. And somewhere beneath those sands, perhaps, an answer is still waiting, patient, composed, and entirely unreadable, just like her face. Sleep well, dear listener. Good night.